Hello and welcome to the Art and Mind Village Chat. I'm Fred Johnson, artist in residence and community engagement specialist here at the Straz Center for the Performing Arts. And we are excited to be with you today. And I'm excited to have with us our real anchor for how we started here, our collaborator from Johns Hopkins University, the executive director of the International Art and Mind Lab, Susan Mag Salmon, and author of Your Brain on Art, the concisive story about the fusion of science and research and the arts. And we have been doing this the village chat for a while, and she's been busy and out in the world, and we're so glad that you're with us, Susan. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad that you're here with us today.
It's great to be here. Wonderful to be here. And I love your paintings behind there. Shout out to Fred Johnson, fredjohnson.com.
Also excited to have with us today Ms. Viev Rada Price, founding executive director of Taya Artistry, a phenomenal organization that fuses the methodology around human behavior along with theater, working deeply in communities to create spaces where we can more deeply understand the commonality that we have as we decide, as we move through our lives through creativity. So truly a phenomenal actualizing organization around arts and healing. Viev, it's really, really an honor to have you with us. And also you are a member of our Art and Mind Village Chat team. So welcome today.
Yes, thank you so much, Fred. And I'm so happy to be here this morning with you all.
Thank you. And we have, for close to a year now, been in conversation and trying to get this gentleman in front of the microphone to share his phenomenal work and his vision. Dr. Patrick Smith from Duke University. We had the opportunity at a major arts and health convening about a year ago, had the opportunity to meet you and begin to understand the work that you do. And we've been chasing you for a long time. So we're really, really happy to have you with us here today. Dr. Patrick Smith, welcome, welcome, welcome to the Art and Mind Village Chat.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this space, and so look forward to the conversation and so grateful and appreciative of the work that you all do.
So I'll start out right away by just saying that my introduction to the formal practice and the world of bioethics was really when I met you a year ago, and was very moved, as we all were, by what you shared. Will you share with us the work that you do and kind of give us an overview of bioethics?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Yeah, I often tell people I kind of stumbled into the space of this thing called bioethics. I was studying a very eclectic educational academic background. Grew up in a African-American community in the southeast part of the United States. And so a lot of the cultural, spiritual, religious, intellectual influences that were part of that cultural tradition early on, I think shaped me. Then went off to university, was doing work in business administration because I had gotten used to a pretty bad habit called eating. And I thought that's like, okay, well, that's the space that I go into if I wanted to get a good job. But it was like during that time where the humanities just began to be reinvigorated in my own heart and mind, thought about shifting over at that point to the humanities. And then a guidance counselor said, yes, you can do that, but you'll extend your time here another year and a half or so. So I say, well, business administration it is. So after finishing that work, I went off to do some some academic study in religious and theological studies, and then got very interested in moral philosophy at that point and went to graduate school to do a PhD in philosophy. Now, I said all that to say that the context in which I was doing moral philosophy can be a bit, abstract in some ways. And I always remember something my uncle would say. He was a civil rights leader for 53 years in Birmingham. He would always have this little phrase when he would talk to us when we were doing other pursuits. He would say, don't forget about the people. right? So that was something that was really important to me. And I felt a little bit of a distance between the kind of academic work that I was doing and just the context of where people live, move, and bumping around and how we bump into each other. And so just through a casual conversation with a couple of friends, there was a gentleman who was the medical director at a local hospice care center where I was in Michigan. He asked me if I'd be interested in sitting on their ethics committee as a community member, because I was, interested in philosophy and ethics. And ended up, that was just a complete change in orientation and exposure to me, where I actually saw this is a real context in which my work, I think, can have some traction. And as I was doing that work in a hospice care center, I was overseeing the ethics department there after some time. And one of the challenges we had to wrestle with was, this question, what does it mean to value life at the end of life? But then the question emerged very quickly in trying to answer that one. What does it mean to value life before the end of life? Meaning that when we think about how poorly poor people die and those on the margins, right, those experiences are sometimes made much more difficult and burdensome than they already are because of these larger social conditions and factors. And so that was my kind of stumbling into the world of bioethics. From there, it just kind of expanded. And after, a couple of decades almost of doing this kind of work, I find myself at Duke University, where I direct the bioethics programs at the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine. Work with a wonderful director of that particular center, who's a historian and pediatrician, who is really interested in doing work in terms of racial justice and telling the racialized history of a place like Durham and Duke Health, and how it can engage in practices of redress and just truth telling in those spaces. So it's a wonderful place for me to be, just at least for the kind of work that I want to do and lean in to think about questions of public health and how it relates to social justice, but then embedding that in the larger conversations of this thing called bioethics. And so very quickly, bioethics is just this word has a kind of interesting history. And let me just jump to the end here and just explain how I would frame this. So bioethics really takes seriously not only questions of ethics and value, what does it mean for us to do life together, but in conversation with science, the natural sciences, I would say the social sciences, and so many technological developments, right? We have the ability to do so much, and we have to ask the question, not what can we do, but what ought we do, right? And that's a very loaded question, right? Because that does get into this area of that there are ways that we can live together that promote a kind of, collective flourishing, and it could be various ways that it happens. And we also know that our collective life is often marked by impediments, right, to flourishing in a wide array of ways. And so we have to wrestle with those issues and attend to that. And for me, bioethics is very comprehensive and very broad. So it's not just what happens in the clinical space between, let's say, professional healthcare practitioners and, let's say, patients, right? But it certainly includes the patient's larger or maybe more immediate social network. So those close loved ones. I think it's a myth to talk about patient autonomy in the sense that it's only just one individual isolated from a larger social unit, from the larger community in which people are embedded. But not only that, right? What happens in the clinical space and the systems, but also the larger environment in which we live, right? The way we relate to non-human animals, right? In terms of biomedical research, there's a reason why researchers want to engage in research on higher level primates, right? Because in many ways, they are like us, right? We do learn something. And if they are like us, then that should raise a lot of moral concern as to what exactly we're doing, larger questions of the environment, right? So environmental ethics, or some would say environmental bioethics, becomes really, really important. So where people live in terms of pollutants and those kinds of things, how it impacts health, and how people present in these spaces based on their larger conditions. And so this is what the fourth wave of public health was talking about, right? The larger social, that health is a largely social condition. And then, so my work is really interested, and I'll say this in closing, in thinking about bioethics in conversation with this fifth wave of public health that looks at these larger upstream systemic drivers. So things like racism, sexism, and questions of how our economic relationships are situated. And so I could go on, but I probably said too much already, so I will stop there.
No,
No.
it's beautiful, really, really beautiful. And, when you talk about bioethics, I think a lot of us really have heard the term, but really haven't unpacked it. So, in some ways, when you were talking, I was thinking it's sort of a third space, right? It's an ombudsman space where it gives humanity an opportunity to really think about values and judgments and what's meaningful and what's within the bounds of what it means to be human for all of us, right? And I'd love for you to share a little bit about how the field really is so diverse. It's not one discipline. It's really a combination, and why that is so important for the community. And then also maybe if you could share a little bit about how this field emerged. We're building this field called neuroarts that is really looking at all the arts, all these different disciplines coming together to understand how arts and aesthetics measurably change the body and brain and behavior, and how that can influence these issues around health, well-being, learning, community building. And even as you mentioned, story is how we come into the world, right? And so I'd love to hear if you could talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary part, how the field was built, and then maybe weaving into the role of arts and aesthetics as a new field, and how we might be able to get some lessons from you.
Wow. Well, I would say lessons from so many others who've come before me that I have kind of inherited in some ways. But thank you so much, Susan, for that very important question here. So yes, as you already identified, bioethics is a very diverse field that's made up of philosophers, ethicists, religionists, social workers, medical doctors, scientists of various sorts. And so it's interesting because there was this debate early on as it was developing, let's say, in a more formal way in the late 60s or so, 70s. Many would say that what is now known as bioethics, conversations about those issues have been going on, right? Long before that, but it's just the certain events that some would say that kind of marked the kind of more formal start of this thing, right? Called bioethics. And so there's this early debate about, well, is it a discipline, right? This discipline. So then there's a particular methodology that comes with academic disciplines, a kind of canon, if you will.
Right.
Those things are always questionable, right? In terms of who decides the canon, who gets in, what voices are we listening to? Nevertheless, in terms of disciplines, right? But then people recognize very early on that it's just so many disciplines that are represented that is it really helpful to think about it as a discipline as opposed to, as the words you use, as a field, right? A field of discourse and action and praxis that includes so many of these different elements. And I think that, yes, that is a challenge, right? Because you have people who are interested in these topics coming from so many different different vantage points. And as you're engaging in teaching, what does the pedagogy look like, right? With such a diverse field and all these resources that you're trying to bring into the onto the table for discourse. And so, yes, there are some unique challenges there, but also I think some wonderful opportunities that we have to bring together, right, all of these resources and the kind of collective, I'll use an antiquated term, collective wisdom that can be drawn from various disciplines and traditions of various sorts, right, that can help inform and reshape our imagination, which is really what we need to do, right? And so when we think about how the field was built, you see these certain markers of just atrocities that were taking place in science, whether it be Nuremberg, whether it be, some always go to like the U.S. syphilis study with regard to Tuskegee, right? But a lot of stuff that was happening before then where medical racism just permeated the teaching of in medical schools and the training of doctors. And we still see vestiges of that today, right? And so you have bioethics kind of emerging when people start giving due attention to many of these challenges, these ethical challenges that we see. Is something is clearly wrong here. And so I do think that the neuro arts, right, that I'm so excited about, brings together these findings in neuroscience, which are very, very important. A lot of conversations happening in bioethics with neuroscience. And then this notion of the arts, right? I use this phrase about shaping the imagination. And I do think that the arts have a significant amount to say to helping us think about these issues. And many folks have incorporated the arts and neuro arts into the world of bioethics. And so I think while you're saying what this field can learn, I want to name here that the field of bioethics is actually already learning from the research that the neuro arts are bringing to the table. But I would just say to more specifically answer your question, Susan, it's just what can we learn? I just think this notion of working through the development of a very diverse group of people and disciplines that are being brought to the table, how to engage in kind of democratic practices, or maybe that's shaped by various motifs in jazz, right? To kind of hold it all together, to listen to one another, to riff off of one another, and to take the best of the insights of these various methodologies and try to figure out what is a vision or a way that we would like the world to be, and then how to begin to actualize that world by being the hands and feet of the imaginations as they're shaped and formed in our minds.
And that's the definition of hope right there. Active hope, and really being able to build that out.
From a somewhat mystical standpoint of view, because I tend to dance in that world.
Yep.
It feels to me like the bridge, if you will, between what bioethics and neuro arts gives us a foundation of understanding, right? A real mind understanding of what's going on and the hows and the whys. And then, the beauty of the arts is the arts is the bridge between the head and the heart. Like the term of, how we ought to be with each other, and understanding how to be with each other, how to function with each other, to realize and call forth systems that have been put in place, to call forth and understand what's happening inwardly in the brain, what's happening, within us, what's happening to our bodies, the natural medicines of our bodies as we traverse the journey of understanding and being with each other, is really, I think, the intersection where Taya artistry really comes in. The work that Taya has been doing for so many years in terms of being curious and creating spaces where we meet with and communicate with people, get to know people's stories, be curious about how they have decided the decisions that they've made in their lives, and then use art as a pathway to open people's desire to hear and feel, right? There's an old mystical philosophy that says the longest distance traveled is the distance between the head and the heart. I think that this fusion of understanding, of bringing forth real fact, of bringing forth real research and science, and then the inclusion of actualizing, creating spaces where we're asking people questions, getting to know people's stories and understand those stories, and then put that into a creative palette where it is both heard and felt, is the stuff that real transformation is made of. Viev, would you talk a bit about Taya artistry and the insight process? Because it is one of the main threads in the tapestry of actualizing and bringing forth a space where the best of bioethics and the best of neuroscience can fuse with how we see ourselves, and how we understand ourselves, and the commonalities in that, so that we can really create transformation.
Yes, happily. And of course, and Patrick and Susan, thank you so much for already the conversation. My head is kind of spinning and swimming in a good way, in a great way. And Patrick, one of the many things you said were just like ignited other thoughts and wonderings for me. So I have a lot of questions actually, but I will start by saying when you talked about your uncle, I believe it was, who said, don't forget about the people. That's really what happened for me in my journey, which was I was doing art, kind of for art's sake, which is great and which is wonderful, but it's also sort of it's got its own lane in a sense, right? And yes, it can inspire, yes, it can open people up, but it also has kind of a traditional way of being created often. And I'm in theater, so it has a traditional way of being created, which is there's a playwright, there's a director, people come to a script that's already been devised by someone, and the question just I was wrestling with, like, but what about what people want to say about it? Or what about what everyone's thinking about this issue, rather than being told, this is the way that we're going to think about this issue, right? So that was always kind of percolating. And then I went to graduate school and I was in conflict analysis and resolution. And in some ways it was the same thing. I mean, not that people hadn't done a lot of research, absolutely. But there was also this sort of, here's the ways in which, here are the methods in which we can make peace. But it felt very divorced in a sense from what was percolating within our communities. So I just kind of kept wrestling with this and thought, if I'd like to really think about, so just to backtrack a second, I went to the Peace Corps, and I was in the Peace Corps when 9/11 happened. And it was a, I mean, there's many things to say about that, but coming back to New York City, having not been part of the actual on the ground event, the way that people were processing, what I came back into was see something, say something. People in a hijab are bad. It's like there was, the kinds of things that were happening on the subway, the ripping off of people's hijabs, just the violence that had been really kicked up in this very, to me, like, whoa, what just happened? I was in Vanuatu, right? I was literally as far as you can be from New York City. And so there was this real desire to wonder with people, what is happening? What is going on in the meaning making of all of us, of Muslims, of non-Muslims, of New Yorkers, of just what are people going through? What are people wondering about? What are people's imaginations doing that are leading us to make these kinds of decisions that are really detrimental to the fabric of the society? Not that this hasn't been going on forever with lots of different, conflicts, but this was the one that was happening in a way that I came into that was just stark. And so that's when I started to use my background in art and art making, and a lot of what I've been learning in my graduate program in conflict resolution, saying, what can we do where taking some of the best of what I've learned in terms of method, and also knowing what art can do, Fred talking beautifully about the head and the heart, beautifully about the opening up of people to feel something in a way that sometimes just the talking or doesn't do. And so that's really where Taya was born, in this desire to get to know how people were making meaning. And I did one of the things that I was very drawn to in my master's program was the insight approach, which, Patrick, you probably know, Bernard Lonergan, having done moral theology. So it's really based on his philosophy, right? So Bernard Lonergan was talking a lot, as philosophers do, about how we make meaning, about our consciousnesses. And he was a theologian as well. And so I was really drawn to how the question of what are we doing when we are making meaning, having relationships? What is that pattern of consciousness? And actually the pattern of consciousness that I was learning about via the insight approach is really dramatic. It's like, whoa, we have experiences, we seek understanding, we verify it, we wonder, what significance does this have to me? We actually deliberate about what we might do, we evaluate what the best thing to do is, and then we do it, and we're back in, right? We're back in this wonderful loop, and it's very dramatic. So we started to gather companies of artists to engage in a process that said, let's really take a look at not only how we're making meaning, but go out in the community and say, what is it that matters to you? What are you worried about? What's that dire future that you're wrestling with? What is that hope for future that you're aspiring to? All of these conversations we had, we call them insight conversations, came back to the group, to the artists, and said, okay, here's all this data. Here's all these stories. Some really there's trends in them. Some are very, very, there's these, these anomalies that are just like stand out as like, whoa, that's a very different kind of story than we're seeing in these trends, and started to create art. And the thing that we did first was being Muslim and non-Muslim post 9/11. So we did a show about the very issues that were, really raging in New York. Went on to take the same issues a bit from a different vantage point, and did a piece about veterans coming home from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So asking, what are the kinds of decisions that you're making now that you're home? What would you want the American people to hear if you could say something? Like all of these questions, and create a piece called Cadence Home. And I could talk from there. Now we're on our 9th piece. But it's a very group devised, very much a collective process of wondering about what is mattering to us, how we're making that meaning, and questioning how we arrive at those decisions that we make.
That's so beautiful. As I listen to you talk, I think of the interconnections of the limbic system, and this idea of fear, and or thinking about the decision making, or how, when you're talking about what do we like, what do we don't like, what's important to us, how the default mode network comes online, and how that all becomes how we bring the world in through our senses is so salient, right? And it's only the things that matter to us are the things that we hold. And so marrying that to these unbelievable moments that you bring forward, we physiologically, psychologically are transformed. And I think that the beauty of that is that it happens in an instant. And it's not, as you said, it's beyond words. It's words aren't even part of the vernacular in terms of how that comes forward in terms of rational conversation. And then the connection between the audience too, right? Like then we understand something in a shared experience, and that creates synchronicity, and that creates community. And at the same time, I just felt this pang of sadness, and we're taking all of these arts out of schools. We're taking them out of the communities. If you want to silence a community, you take the arts out, right? If you want to cripple a community, you say, there's no space for that. And I think that's the moral dilemma in some ways that we face right now, is how do we bring that forward in the ways that you're describing? It's so critical and experiential, right? I mean, we're talking about experiences, not textbooks, and not filling in the bubbles, but really having those experiences.
Yeah, and that's and creating a fusion, and a real understanding of how all of these pathways come together to work. Where I feel like we're at a place where we're working to not departmentalize, but to really create an overlay. I mean, one example of that, which I try to do, is, take pages from Susan's book and sing them, and people receive them in a totally different way. Or at gatherings, and this is as old as time itself. I mean, these practices that I've been guided to have come from teachers from West Africa, from the ancient traditions of how the community came together before there was conversation about decisions to be made for the greater good. We sang together, we danced together, we ate together, we created from the inside out a communal sense of connectedness, so that when we heard the decisions and concepts that were to be made for the greater good of the community, they would be received fully and there wasn't this sort of juxtaposition of, hey, let's manipulate that. Now, I mean, you know, some of that has changed, but all of the ancient traditions did that. That's why there we gained strength from anthem. We gained strength from song. The interesting thing is that from the African American experience, the perception originally was if we were singing, we probably were happy. When in fact it was our pathway of really being able to touch ourselves from within and communicate from without a way forward. So, Dr. Smith, um, I know you're a lover of jazz because we've talked about that a little bit. I think what, and Susan, we've talked with jazz artists and we've talked with modern dancers, and so this fusion of the intentionality of the artist and the understanding of the pathways that are created, the ethical pathways that are created to acknowledge the importance of that, the neural pathways that are created, when people hear, I mean, um, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. Like Dr. Smith, what's the value in artistic expression, in that sort of framework, that roadmap of creativity that has been a part of the fingerprint of the way forward in terms of especially disadvantaged communities finding a way?
Hmm.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Fred, this is so powerful, and just resonates so deeply with me, because, and for me, this is not academic, right? As you start putting your finger on things, and just remember, growing up in the space that I did, in terms of this notion of the importance of song, right? And then thinking about later on, the way work songs of a particular sort become a genre unto themselves, right? In terms of really beginning to think about what's really happening and what's going on here, right? And the ability of music and various forms of the arts to help transcend situations while also still being embedded, right? So it's still marked by kind of realism, but I think, as Susan mentioned a little bit earlier, still kind of gesturing towards this notion of hope, even if it's in some ways undefined or maybe even ill-defined, right? In some ways, but something that continues to have this motivation power to say we have to keep on keeping on, or whatever phrases that we use. And so, however trite it may sound to contemporary listeners, right? It played a very significant role, and I think still does and can play a significant role in terms of how the arts come together with regard to finding ethical possibilities, right, in the site or the space of injustice. And so when I often think about think about the main components like social justice movements, right, and how something like, let's just take one example of expression of art, like protest art, can map onto that, right? So when you think about like social justice movements, you'll have things like an awakening to suffering, right? So that's part of the social justice movement. Say, how can we become awakened to the suffering of people? How do we let that suffering speak in such a way that we have eyes to see and ears to hear, right? But it's not only awakening to suffering, but it's this emotional engagement, right? So again, we talked about this notion of the heart, right? And you mentioned this distance between the head and the heart, right? But yet social justice movements have to think about ways of emotional engagement. And then there's the kind of social justice critique of the current condition. So yes, awakening to suffering, letting suffering speak, a kind of emotional engagement, right? How we emote to situations, but then a social justice critique, say things aren't the way that they are supposed to be. And there's a different way forward. And then there's this other element in social justice movements, which is mobilization, right? So maybe if we could use the metaphor that we've been running from head to heart to hands, right? And then this notion of mobilization, and then the pressure that we bring to bear to change the situation. So as one of my old professors said, maybe that includes the habitat. So we have a full 4-H club now, right? Head, heart, hands, habitat, right? And so when you think about these social justice movements and these historical markers, and think about protest art, right? How it in many ways maps onto those, right? The awakening to suffering, whether it be through the literary arts, whether it be through the visual arts, the musical arts, whatever the case may be, theater, awakening to suffering, a kind of emotional engagement. And again, there are different ways to make the social justice critique more explicit. That's often implicit in certain forms of art. And then obviously the mobilization piece, right? What are we to now do, and brings a way of kind of pressure for mobilization for change, right? And so anyway, so I just think that all those things can come together in some very creative ways, and others are much better at bringing those elements together from those observations, I believe. So,
and to add to that, I think in the mobilization phase, there are actions, strategies, implementation plans, there's answers or there's solutions. It's very much around what you're doing. And then there's an evaluation of that mobilization and how do you re-engage. And I see it small and large in the arts, thinking about when you're talking about patients, this idea of humanizing medicine is a relatively new concept, right? In terms of teaching medical students how to tolerate ambiguity, how to be more compassionate, how to actually hear the voices, the narratives of families that have loved ones that are in some place in the healthcare system, whether it's end of life, chronic illness, acute care. And so I think we're actually coming back to, it's so funny because do no harm is something that we say, but we don't do, right? Just because of the production of healthcare. And healthcare is extraordinary, right? It's an amazing thing. But when it's so inequitably distributed, it makes it incredibly unjust. And even the cycle of how we churn through and teach people how to be doctors is in many ways not ethical. And so I think narrative, story, and it's also, there are certain things that in art that are not accessible. When we think about high art, fine art, all of that. But when we define art as creative expression, we all can do that like now. And I love that the theater work that you're doing acknowledges each person's creative voice just in what they are hoping for and wanting and what they're identifying. I think that's really, I'd love to understand more about how you bring your work back into the community to witness, to mirror what because in some ways you're mirroring, right, what you've heard and bringing that forward and how that happens.
Yeah. And so one of the things I was just thinking about, and this is more of these are questions that I'm wrestling with. And in part, it goes to Patrick, what you were talking about in terms of the 4 H's, and Susan about how do you bring it back into the community. And one of the things that I've found is that it seems to me, so art does awaken, art alivens, art wakes you up to something, right? So often good art, you go and you're like, oh, I didn't know, or I didn't really let myself know something. Yeah. But I also have been to countless things, mostly, again, I'm in theater a lot. So I've been to so many plays that awaken you and yet do this thing, which is like, either you should have known, how dare you not have known, or like, we're going to awaken you and connect you emotionally and leave you there.
Yeah.
You can wrestle around with your guilt, and there's real merit there on the one hand. And I know a lot of people who walk away and say, well, that's just too big for me. That's too much. I feel so shitty now, sorry, everyone. I feel so defeated. I feel so badly. I feel so guilty. And thus I don't know what to do with any of those feelings. Right. And so one of the things that I've wrestled with Taya, and this is about bringing it, like, how do you want your audiences and the communities that you're bringing together to then move on from being awakened, emotionally connected into this, like, I want to be part of it. I want to do something. But the first thing I need to do is to do some of this, like, okay, who am I when I walk back out into the world? Not a defeated, guilty, I don't want to touch that, but like, I can really see that I do that sometimes, and what do I want to then do about that? How can I change my consciousness? How can I change and wonder about and elevate and break out of this truncated way of being and seeing into something that is more mindful?
See, I think this is, I think this is we're at this is the opportunity that we have now. For me, this is the advantage of having science and research and our academic community and our arts community recognizing and beginning to define the creative tissue, the connective tissue that, back in the early 2000s, just before I actually had the opportunity to meet Viev, I was working at an organization in New York City, and I was running a program. I was overseeing a program called Arts at the Intersection. And the executive director, when I first came to work there, he said, well, what's your end game? And my end game has always been to redefine the role of art and creativity as catalysts for transformation. Like we do a lot of work in the community through our community engagement department, and we do town halls and things of that nature. And all people always say, well, you know what, I might come to the theater more, or might be involved in this if I felt like I see myself in it. It's like, I want to see me. I want to feel the point of relativity. So here we have an opportunity through this emergence of the creative artists and, the actualizers, the facilitators of that, to merge with our bioethics colleagues and folk who can really teach us about the history and the realities that exist, the real realities that exist, and then merge with our neural arts colleagues to say, yes, and while you're experiencing in this space, while you're experiencing art, this is what's happening with your brain. This is what's happening inwardly with your neurological system. And we create on stage experiences where we see and feel the commonality of each other. One of the things that I always really admired about Taya artistry is after there was a talk back, there was an opportunity for people to share what they felt. It's like there's a lot of conversation being had in the academic community now that one of the most common elements of Homo sapiens is we want to feel safe, right? We want to feel safe. We want to be heard. So again, if we are able to, unlike this Zoom call where we're in these boxes, right? If we're able to merge the reality that says all of human life, essentially, we have the same needs, but we tend to clan up and tribe up, you know what I mean? But if we give ourselves permission to recognize that either we all get through this together or we all suffer together, so the realities that exist that, is that these parts of the bioethic equation, it's important for all of us to know this part of our participation. I had an old master teacher that said, your drum and the sound of the voice and the rhythm of the metal, the bell, it's like you feel it. Don't give your any healing process, you're the co-therapist in that process. And so how do we co-create health and well-being in terms of understanding the implications on all of us if we're unethical with each other? The implications of if we just give all of our power away and don't recognize that the experiences that we have in the spaces that we're in have an effect upon our mind's ability to function, our body's ability to feel whole and complete. And, and I believe that that's the reason why art was created, because art is that other palette. It's that other communal voice where you can step back and go, oh, I know how I feel that. Not I know it, but I feel that.
Well, we say that we talk about that in terms of evolutionary biology, right? Like the difference between our species and all the other species are that we had this ability to be able to reflect, interpret, have insight, and share that as an emotive connector. And, when we harnessed fire and we came around the hearth and we started to share values and ethics with each other and what was the communal need, I think, we can go all the way back to the birth of our species and how that developed. I think I'd love to shift for a second because I think, Fred, what you hit the notes that you hit are about making notes where you said, we have the same needs. We all need to get through this together. We need to be safe. We need to be heard. Yet human history has not necessarily honored that, right? And so I'm a privileged white woman. Neither one of my parents went to college, but I had the ability to go to college. I went to a community college. I worked my way. I'm one of 5 girls. I didn't understand sexual differences, gender differences until I got out into the real world. And then I was like, screw that. I'm going to start my own businesses. Right. So but I had privilege. Right. And I think when you were talking about the way that sometimes art pushes us to feel guilty or pushes us to feel uncomfortable, and let me just preface this by saying, I don't think there's any right answer. I think we're also individual around what actually moves us. But over the last 5 years, in looking at this last round of racial justice, which I think has really been incredibly powerful and made tremendous progress, I have felt shame. I have felt guilt. I have felt on my knees, like, whoa. And from my perch, I've tried to be a better listener. Fred's been a real guide for me, about what are you complicit in and what aren't you complicit in? And so I guess my question is there a level of discomfort, physical, psychological discomfort that we actually need in order to get off our asses, and is that just different for everybody? And then I also think there is, from an artist point of view, sometimes you put something out because it's what you have to say, and maybe that's less the professional artist, right? Because I always say I make poetry, but I'm not a poet. But a poet has a job, right? They want you to feel something potentially. And so I feel like there's these different ways that we interpret all of this. But I guess coming back to my question is there emotional states that are important for transformation that we have to go through? And how do we elicit those, awakening to suffering, emotional engagement? Do we need to empathize? Do we need to have compassion? Are those prerequisites for change, for personal change and then societal change?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, absolutely. And so when I think that art that brings you to your knees, as you said so beautifully, is a prerequisite for change. It is a prerequisite for the awakening. It is part of the awakening. It's part of being awoken, right? And so the guilt that you can experience, oh gee, I'm sorry, it's uncomfortable. No, yes, it's like, be in it. But there's a way to do it. I feel like what happens sometimes with pieces that I've seen is that there's an intentionality of like, we're going to sort of hit you with this. And then there's not something that happens afterwards. And to say to audiences, now this is your work to do. Absolutely. Go do your work. Yes. And yet I do think there's something that we can do with the art, with the community conversations that we have afterwards, that really enable people to wrestle around with those feelings in a safe, in a communal, and not even communal, I mean like right there and then have to talk through it. But there's something about being awoken also, or awakened to your own consciousness, to being very, very, getting very much in touch with like, here's where that guilt is coming from. And here's what perhaps I can do with it and for it. And what is it that I'm so worried about? What is that dire future I'm so trying to prevent against, right? That guilt is a signal for me to run. That guilt is a signal for me to get up and walk away now. So it's that kind of exploration that I want to push our pieces and our audiences to do together. And again, or give the tools to do once you walk out of the theater. I remember seeing a piece that was really incredible about Jordanian refugees. And it left you with all the feelings. And what you did on your way out is they gave you a postcard to write your congressperson.
Oh, I love that.
Well, yes, and so it's interesting. So it did give you kind of that when you talked about the like sort of the hands, right, Patrick? Like okay, what can you do now? It was almost too for me. It was almost too much of an easy fix. Okay, feeling all these things. Put your name on this postcard, stick it in the mail, and you're done.
Mm.
And I thought, well, yes, sure, of course,
Yeah.
but I'm still like, whoa, all these feelings, all these things I didn't know, all these stories I hadn't heard. Oh, but now I've gotten to stick my thing in the, put a stamp on it, stick it in the mailbox, and now I'm absolved somehow. Like that's the move I thought was sort of happening, that I want to stay with like, we're feeling these things, we're wrestling with these things. Like, what does it mean for our own, what does it mean for our own transformation? What does it mean to go from this kind of righteous and certain place of like, I already know, or I don't know, and that's fine, or whatever those, how I can be righteous and certain, to blow that open, to destabilize, but then in that destabilization to also provide some kind of questions, not answers, but questions that keep you moving in that destabilized place, that get you wrestling with the who do I want to be in this world now?
Mm-hmm.
If I just say, I really appreciate your analysis there and your response. And, I was just thinking about from certain, so yeah, I mean, I think there's this phrase often that social ethicists use that, we have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Because when you actually think about the deep injustices, and if these deep injustices are tied to the larger social fabric and cultural and contextual world in which we live, we're all drawn into this, right? I mean, so as the good Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, right, would say, he says, look, all may not be directly guilty, but all are responsible. Right. Mm-hmm. Meaning that we may say, well, I'm distanced from a certain kind of activity or event, but we are caught, as King would say, in this inextricable network of, mutuality, such that we all are responsible, as you said. And there's something that shows up in certain religious traditions. It shows up in like Jewish expressions of religion, certainly Christian traditions of religion, but this notion of lament, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's something powerful about that, even for those who aren't religious, right? The role of lament was to just see widespread injustice and suffering and just stop. Mm-hmm. Just stop and mourn and grieve and recognize that things are not the way that they are supposed to be, right? Now, we may not know exactly how they're supposed to be and all of that other kind of stuff, but certainly it ain't this, right? So whatever it is, it can't be this, right? Mm-hmm. And to just stop, pause, grieve, to recalibrate, right? And this role of lament, I think, is something important because you need space to be able to do that, right? Mm-hmm. To think, to see why our conditions are the way that they are, and this widespread suffering, and then begin to figure out, okay, what is the self-work that we need to do? What is the structural work that we need to do? What's the practical work with the postcards, right? In some ways, and all these things coming together. And I think this really helps us to have the kind of humility that's appropriate and grace that's appropriate to do social justice work, because one has to be so careful, right, of the kind of self-righteousness that can be inculcated, right, for, when trying to do this kind of work. But when we have space to lament, right, kind of as you were saying, and at least I was hearing and just kind of interpolating, right, in some ways, right, that we can do that self-work that recognizes that we're all caught up in this and we're all complicit, that we can't be self-righteous, and the same grace that I need to have that same grace towards others as we fight to change these structures and the social conditions that's causing this untold suffering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree and feel that so strongly. And I think, again, in the great lyrics from Sting, on and on the rain may fall like tears from a star, like tears from a star. On and on the rain will say how fragile we are, how fragile we are. I think if we recognize more deeply that we're all just one breath away from that fragile place, as we look online and see rushing waters and, communities that are being overrun by water, or we look at the devastation of war. We look at how fragile we all are, how we seem to be in a place where we have gotten accustomed to looking the other way, or just saying, well, what can I do about it? But to realize inwardly the importance and the responsibility that we have towards each other and for each other, to recognize that there's so much that we can learn and understand in ways that don't feel threatening, because oftentimes when we begin to have challenging conversations, a part of us, we shut off because it's too painful to hear, or we, or to recognize that there are things that we can do each and every day of our life that are good for our body, our mind, and our spirit, and that the commitment to come together and share creative experiences to really cultivate a deeper connection to each other is a really, really beautiful thing. We could go on and on and on and on. This is such a powerful and important conversation, Dr. Smith. I want to thank you so very much for taking out the time to be with us. We look forward to you continuing to be a part of our Art and Mind Village chat journey. Viev, thank you so much for the work that you do and the continued work that you do, and your participation with our Art and Mind Village chat team. And as always, we would not be here if it wasn't for the wisdom and the guidance of Susan Mag-Salmon to create this wonderful collaboration as we move forward. Our thanks to the entire Art and Mind Village chat team that helps to put all the nuts and bolts together in order to make this happen. We are excited. This is the culmination of this season, and we prepare now for next season. We've learned so much. We've been inspired in so many ways, and folk are really, really coming together. So we want to also thank each and every one of you for sharing your most valuable commodity, and that is your time. We are finding ways to expand this message and create opportunities for us to know more about each other, to find ways to be back together again, to find those measures of commonality, to enrich and enhance our understanding of the relationship between science, research, art, the academic community, and just reframing and re-understanding that we are better together, we're stronger together. And I love the whole concept of head, heart, hand, and habitat. So we got a whole new. I'm deepening into that, Dr. Smith. That's a really beautiful
4-H.
4-H. I'm defining a new 4-H. Right.
That was from an old professor. That was from an old professor years ago. Yeah.
Thank you all so very much. Yes, Susan.
I was gonna maybe close out on, I had an opportunity to meet with Emmanuel Pratt, who runs something called the Sweetwater Foundation up in South Side of Chicago. It's an urban farm and integrates all kinds of arts in it. And it's really an oasis in a space that is really very much a desert. And he uses this term, small is beautiful. And I was like, okay, I get that. And I said, how does small become big? And he said, that's a great question. Small becomes big when lots of smalls connect to each other, and then all of a sudden you get big. And I feel like that's what we're doing here. We have lots of these beautiful small things that are just beautiful in and of themselves. But as we connect them, we create a network, we create a quilt, we create a community. And that's what I feel about today, is that we really are creating something, connections that make something whole. And so I'm really proud to be with you. And I wanted to say thank you too.
Yes, I thank you. And I love the idea of like all the smalls connected become something, grand and big, and, not that we're not meaningful in our places, but God, when we connect, we're stronger together. Right. So
yeah.
We thrive. And when we suffer, we suffer. So it's really, thank you so much. I've just loved being part of this conversation. Just loved it.
I just think you all are amazing, and I'm just happy to be a part of this. I'm really thrilled and tickled pink to be in this conversation with you all, and looking forward to the work in the days to come.
Thank you.